No opportunity is going to be so perfectly timed that it bypasses the internal obstacles that have stopped every previous opportunity from producing what it should have produced. The transformation has to be forced, by me, on myself, in the absence of any guarantee that it will work, in the presence of every fear that it won't, with no external authority to validate the decision and no timeline that makes the difficulty temporary. It has to be forced now, here, from exactly the position I am currently in, which is the position I have always been waiting to escape before beginning. Most people have this conversation. Very few act on it. And the gap between having the conversation and acting on it is not a gap of intention. It is not a gap of desire. Almost everyone desires transformation. The desire for a better life, a truer life, a life more fully inhabited and more genuinely expressive of what the person actually is and actually capable of. That desire is nearly universal. The gap is something else. It is the gap between the wanting and the willingness to pay what the wanting actually costs. And what it costs is not what most people expect it to cost. It does not cost primarily time or money or physical effort, though it costs those things too. It costs comfort. It costs the familiar. It costs the story you have been telling about why the life you are living is the best available version given the constraints, given the history, given what happened to you and what was done to you and what you were not given that you should have been given. It costs the identity you have built around not yet having become who you are trying to become, which is an identity that many people are more attached to than they realize and less willing to surrender than they would ever admit. Transformation costs you the person you currently are. And that person, however limited and however unhappy, is the only self you have direct experience of being. Surrendering them for someone you have not yet met, someone who exists only as a direction and a possibility, is the real price. And most people, when they encounter that price honestly, find a reason to defer it. One more year. One more change in circumstances. One more attempt at the incremental approach that has failed before but might work this time if the conditions are slightly more favorable. One more reason why now is not quite the right moment. Why the starting point needs to be slightly different. Why the transformation can begin after this particular difficulty has passed rather than through it. Daniel Goleman spent decades studying the psychology of human performance at its highest levels, studying what distinguishes the people who actually become who they are capable of becoming from the far larger population of people who carry that capability throughout their lives without ever fully deploying it. And what he found, documented across research in neuroscience, developmental psychology, organizational behavior, and the study of peak performance in every domain he examined, was not primarily a story about talent, not a story about intelligence, not a story about opportunity or timing or the particular advantages that some people have and others don't, though all of those things have their role. What he found at the center of every genuine transformation he studied was something more fundamental and more demanding than any of those things. He found that the people who transformed, who actually crossed the distance between the life they were living and the life they were capable of living, were the people who had developed what he called emotional intelligence at a level sufficient to override the psychological machinery that keeps most people exactly where they are. They had developed the capacity to see themselves accurately enough to stop lying to themselves productively. They had developed the capacity to regulate their own internal states powerfully enough to act in the presence of fear, rather than waiting for the fear to resolve. They had developed the capacity to sustain motivation through the long, unglamorous, unrewarded middle of the transformation process, where most people give up because the beginning enthusiasm has faded and the end result is not yet visible and the only thing present is the difficulty. And they had developed, crucially, the capacity to force on themselves the experiences that the transformation required, even when every instinct and every comfort preference and every voice of reasonable caution was arguing for the safer, smaller, more manageable alternative. Forcing transformation means something specific. It does not mean violence toward the self. It does not mean the crushing of the human need for rest and recovery and the ordinary pleasures that make life worth transforming toward in the first place. It means the refusal to allow the self's preference for comfort to be the deciding vote in every significant decision. It means the deliberate, consistent, often uncomfortable practice of choosing the action that serves the person you are becoming over the action that serves the person you currently are, in the knowledge that the person you currently are will argue, with great eloquence and genuine feeling, for the more comfortable choice every single time, and that listening to that argument without examining whose interests it actually serves is the mechanism by which most people's transformations remain permanently deferred. It means understanding that the self that needs to be transformed is also the self that will be doing the transforming, and that this is not a paradox to be resolved but a tension to be managed. The tension between the part of you that knows what is required and the part of you that will resist it. Not from malice, but from the deep biological, neurologically embedded preference for the known over the unknown that every human nervous system shares and that has kept the human species alive across conditions that would have eliminated any creature less committed to the safety of the familiar. The neuroscience of this resistance is worth understanding in detail. Not because understanding it makes it disappear, but because understanding it correctly changes the nature of the struggle. Most people experience their resistance to transformation as a moral failure, as laziness, weakness, lack of discipline, the specific personal inadequacy of someone who can see what needs to be done and consistently fails to do it. This interpretation is not only inaccurate but actively harmful, because it produces shame, and shame is among the most reliable inhibitors of the very behavior it is supposedly motivating. The person who interprets their resistance as moral failure becomes increasingly convinced that the problem is something fundamental and unfixable about who they are, which is precisely the interpretation most likely to produce the paralysis they are trying to escape. The accurate interpretation is different and considerably more useful. The resistance to transformation is not a moral failure. It is the operation of a nervous system doing exactly what nervous systems were designed to do: minimizing exposure to the unknown, conserving resources by maintaining established patterns, and treating any significant deviation from the established pattern as a potential threat requiring either avoidance or mobilization of the stress response. The brain is not lazy, it is efficient. It is running the most metabolically economical version of your life that it knows how to run, and the most metabolically economical version is the one it already knows, which is the one you are already living. Transformation is expensive in precisely the neurological terms that the brain is designed to minimize. It requires the construction of new neural pathways in a system that is already deeply committed to existing ones. It requires sustained engagement with uncertainty in a system calibrated for threat detection and risk avoidance. It requires the tolerating of discomfort that is genuine and immediate in the service of outcomes that are uncertain and distant, which is the precise trade that the brain's reward system is least equipped to evaluate favorably. Goleman drew on the research of his contemporaries in neuroscience, particularly the work on the prefrontal cortex and its relationship to the amygdala, to explain what is actually happening in the person who is trying to change and finding the change almost impossibly difficult. The prefrontal cortex is the seat of everything the transformation requires: the long-term thinking, the capacity to delay gratification, the ability to override automatic responses with considered ones, the sophisticated emotional regulation that allows a person to feel fear and act anyway, to feel the pull of the comfortable, and choose the necessary instead. The amygdala is the seat of everything the transformation is fighting against: the threat detection, the automatic activation of avoidance and protection responses, the emotional flooding that makes clear thinking temporarily impossible and that makes the comfortable choice feel not just preferable but urgent. And the relationship between them is not a relationship of equals. The amygdala is faster, older, and under conditions of stress, overwhelmingly more powerful. The prefrontal cortex is slower, more recently evolved, and its function is the first thing compromised when the stress response activates. Which means that the moments when transformation is most necessary, the moments of genuine difficulty, genuine fear, genuine confrontation with the gap between the current self and the required one, are precisely the moments when the neural system most responsible for making the transformative choice is most suppressed and the neural system most responsible for the retreat to the comfortable is most activated. The architecture of the brain makes transformation genuinely hard in a specific and measurable way. Understanding this does not make it easier, but it prevents the additional burden of believing that the difficulty is a personal failing rather than a neurological fact that every human being faces equally and that every genuine transformation has had to find a way through. The way through is not around the resistance. It is not the elimination of the fear or the anxiety or the discomfort that the transformation produces. Every approach that promises to make transformation comfortable, to align the stars so that the necessary changes feel natural and easy and in flow, is either describing a very minor transformation or misrepresenting the nature of a major one. Genuine transformation, the kind that changes who you actually are rather than what you are temporarily doing, does not feel like flow, at least not most of the time and not in the beginning. It feels like the sustained decision to move in a specific direction in the face of everything in your nervous system arguing for a different one. The way through is the development of the specific capacities that make that sustained decision possible. The capacity to tolerate discomfort without immediately acting to relieve it. The capacity to remain present with your own fear without being entirely defined and directed by it. The capacity to sustain a vision of who you are becoming through the long periods when the becoming is not visible in any external result, and the only evidence that you are on the right path is the internal evidence of a person who has decided to trust their own judgment about what their life requires. These capacities are not given. They are built. They are built through exactly the process of forcing the transformation, through the repeated experience of choosing the harder thing and surviving it, of acting in the presence of fear and discovering that the fear was survivable, of tolerating the discomfort of the unfamiliar long enough for it to become slightly less unfamiliar and therefore slightly less threatening to the nervous system that was treating it as danger. The first transformation that has to be forced before any other transformation becomes sustainable is the transformation in how you see yourself, not in the affirmation sense, not in the practice of asserting a positive self-image until the assertion becomes belief, but in the deeper and more demanding sense of developing an accurate, rather than a comfortable relationship with who you actually are. Most people carry a self-image that is a negotiated settlement between what they aspire to be and what they fear they actually are, with the negotiation conducted almost entirely in the direction of the more comfortable assessment and defended against any evidence that would disturb the settlement. This is not vanity in the conventional sense. It is the ego's primary protective function, the maintenance of a narrative about the self that is stable and coherent enough to support continued functioning. The ego does not want an accurate self-image. It wants a stable one. And stability and accuracy are not the same thing, and when they conflict, the ego will sacrifice accuracy before it sacrifices stability almost every time. The consequence of this is that most people are navigating their own lives with a map that has been drawn more for comfort than for accuracy, and they are mystified by the persistence of the gap between where the map says they should be arriving and where they are actually arriving because the map looks right to them. It feels right. It is the map they have always used. The possibility that the map is wrong, that the self-image is significantly inaccurate in ways that are producing the outcomes they are trying to escape, is the possibility that is most difficult to examine honestly because it threatens the foundational stability that the ego has organized everything else around. Goleman identified self-awareness as the foundational capacity of emotional intelligence not as a platitude but as a precise psychological claim. The person who lacks genuine self-awareness is not simply unaware of themselves in some general sense. They are operationally blind to the feedback loop that would allow them to change. They cannot see clearly enough what they are actually doing as opposed to what they intend to do or believe they are doing to make the corrections that genuine improvement requires. They attribute the outcomes of their behavior to external causes because the internal causes are not visible to them, not because they are dishonest, but because the self-image that would have to be disturbed by accurate self-assessment is protected by psychological defenses that operate below the level of conscious awareness and that are in many cases extremely sophisticated. The person who is chronically late tells themselves they are bad at estimating time rather than examining what the chronic lateness communicates about how they value other people's time. The person whose relationships consistently end in the same way tells themselves they attract the wrong kind of people rather than examining what they consistently bring to relationships that produces the consistent outcome. The person whose professional life has stalled tells themselves the environment is unfair or the timing is wrong or the right opportunity hasn't appeared, rather than examining what they are consistently doing or failing to do that is producing the stall. None of these people are lying exactly. They believe their explanations. The explanations feel true. And they feel true because the self-image that would be disturbed by the accurate alternative is being protected by exactly the machinery that is supposed to help them understand themselves. Forcing the transformation in self-awareness means doing something that the ego will resist with everything available to it. It means choosing, deliberately and consistently, to seek the accurate assessment over the comfortable one. It means asking people whose honesty you trust what they actually see, and then resisting the immediate impulse to explain, qualify, contextualize, and reframe their observations until the observations no longer threaten the self-image. It means looking at the actual outcomes of your behavior over time, not the intended outcomes, not the outcomes you were aiming for, but the outcomes that actually arrived, and tracing them back to what you were actually doing rather than what you thought you were doing, and remaining with what that tracing reveals long enough for it to become genuinely informative rather than immediately defended against. It means developing the capacity to be wrong about yourself without that wrongness becoming catastrophic. To discover that you have been operating with a significant misunderstanding of your own behavior or your own motivations, and to receive that discovery as information rather than as an indictment. This capacity, the capacity to update the self-image in response to accurate feedback without the update feeling like annihilation, is one of the most difficult things to develop and one of the most transformative once developed, because it converts the entire external world from a place that needs to be managed for its threats to the self-image into a place that can be mined for information about what is actually happening and what therefore actually needs to change. The second transformation that no one else can force for you is the transformation in your relationship with discomfort. This is not the same as becoming someone who enjoys discomfort or who is indifferent to it. It is the development of a genuinely different relationship with the experience of discomfort. A relationship in which discomfort is information rather than signal to stop, in which the presence of anxiety in the body is evidence that you are moving in the direction the transformation requires rather than evidence that you should stop moving, in which the felt sense of difficulty is understood as the feeling of growth rather than the feeling of danger. This reframing is not a trick, and it is not simply a matter of telling yourself a different story until the story changes the feeling. It is a genuine perceptual shift that develops through the repeated experience of moving through discomfort and discovering that what was on the other side of it was not destruction but expansion. Every time you choose the action that the fear was arguing against, and survive it, and find that the survival produced something the avoidance would have prevented, the nervous system learns something. Not immediately, not dramatically, not in a way that eliminates the next fear, but cumulatively, across dozens and eventually hundreds of these experiences. The nervous system accumulates evidence that challenges its prior assessment of what discomfort means and what it predicts. The person who has 30 experiences of moving through significant fear and finding genuine expansion on the other side has a different nervous system, in a measurable functional sense, than the person who has avoided significant discomfort for the same 30 experiences. Not because their biology is different, because their accumulated experience of what happens when you act in the presence of fear has been different, and the brain's predictive function, its continuous work of anticipating what will happen based on what has happened before, has been trained on different data. This is the neurological basis for what people sometimes describe as confidence, and what they often mistakenly believe is either innate or circumstantially produced. Genuine confidence is not the absence of fear. Every person who has done genuinely difficult things will tell you, if they are honest about it, that the fear never fully goes away. What changes is the relationship with it. The confident person is not fearless. They are a person whose accumulated experience of acting in the presence of fear and surviving and growing has trained their nervous system to produce a different interpretation of the fear signal. Not danger, but signal that something that matters is at stake, which is a very different thing and produces a very different behavioral response. The person who has never forced themselves through significant discomfort has not accumulated this training. Their nervous system is interpreting fear correctly given its available data. Its available data is that significant discomfort has always been avoided, which tells the system that significant discomfort is something that must be avoided, which makes the next significant discomfort feel more dangerous and more urgent to escape. The avoidance of discomfort trains the nervous system to require the avoidance of discomfort. The tolerance of discomfort trains the nervous system to tolerate discomfort. The choice between these two training programs is made in every single moment of genuine difficulty. And most people, most of the time, without examining the choice or its long-term consequences, choose the former. And then they wonder why the difficulty never seems to become easier, why the fear never seems to diminish, why the transformation that was supposed to happen keeps not happening despite the genuine desire for it. The third transformation that must be forced is the transformation in how you use time. Not in the productivity optimization sense, not the scheduling and systemizing and habit stacking approaches that fill an entire genre of self-help literature, but in the more fundamental sense of the relationship between how you actually spend your hours and what those hours are actually building. Most people, if they were to audit their time honestly, not how they believe they spend it or how they would describe spending it, but how they actually spend it, hour by hour, with the behavior observed rather than the intention reported, would discover a significant and disturbing gap between the investment of time and the life they say they are trying to build. Not because they are lazy in the conventional sense. Most people are busy. Most people are genuinely tired. Most people have real demands on their time from real obligations that are not optional and not easily reduced. But within the discretionary portion of time, The hours that are genuinely available for choice, that are not consumed by genuine obligations. The allocation is almost always primarily toward comfort, rather than transformation, toward entertainment, rather than development, toward the management of present discomfort, rather than the building of future capacity, toward the activities that the brain's reward system rewards immediately and reliably over the activities that the transformation requires and that produce their rewards slowly, uncertainly, and only after extended periods of unrewarded effort. Goleman's research on motivation, and specifically on the difference between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, provides the most useful framework for understanding why the time allocation problem is so persistent and so difficult to address through simple intention. The activities that build genuine transformation are almost always intrinsically rewarding in the deep sense. They produce, eventually and sustainably, a kind of satisfaction that the comfort activities cannot match. But they are not intrinsically rewarding in the immediate sense. The reward for the transformative activity is delayed, uncertain, and dependent on a level of sustained engagement that produces significant discomfort before it produces any satisfaction. The reward for the comfort activity is immediate, reliable, and requires nothing from the person that the person is not already comfortable providing. The brain's reward system does not evaluate these options neutrally. It has a strong and continuously expressed bias toward the option that produces the more immediate and more certain reward. And overcoming that bias, consistently enough and long enough to build the neural infrastructure of genuine transformation, requires something that is neither willpower in the brute force sense nor the elimination of the bias, but rather the deliberate construction of conditions in which the transformative choice is made easier and the comfort choice is made slightly harder. A restructuring of the environment and the routine and the social context that changes the default, rather than requiring continuous effortful override of the default. This is one of the most practically important insights in Goleman's entire body of work, and it is one of the ones most consistently misapplied by people who encounter it. The misapplication is to treat the problem of transformation as primarily a problem of will, of mustering enough determination and discipline to overcome the resistance and choose the transformative action consistently. This approach fails not because determination and discipline are unimportant, but because they are insufficient on their own for the sustained period that genuine transformation requires. Determination and discipline are finite resources. They deplete under conditions of stress, fatigue, and sustained demand. They are most available exactly when the transformation is easiest and least available exactly when the transformation is hardest. The person relying primarily on will to force their transformation is relying on the resource that is most scarce precisely when the forcing most demands it. The more durable approach is the restructuring of circumstances, the deliberate arrangement of your environment, your relationships, your routines, and your commitments in ways that make the transformative choice the path of least resistance rather than the path of maximum resistance, so that the finite and depletable resource of will is reserved for the moments of genuine crisis rather than consumed by the daily friction of choosing against default conditions that are arranged for comfort rather than growth. The practical manifestations of this restructuring are different for every person and every transformation, but the underlying principle is consistent. You change what surrounds you. You change who you spend time with, because the people you spend time with are not neutral to your transformation. They are either pulling you toward it or pulling you away from it, not always through explicit encouragement or discouragement, but through the more powerful and more invisible mechanism of what their presence normalizes. Spend your time with people for whom the level you are trying to reach is already ordinary, and your nervous system will begin to recalibrate its sense of what is possible and what is expected. Spend your time with people for whom your current level is already exceptional, and the recalibration goes in the other direction. This is not a harsh judgment about the value of any particular relationship. It is a factual account of how the social environment shapes the psychological baseline, which shapes the behavior, which shapes the outcome. The people you are around most frequently are, in a very real and measurable sense, setting the parameters within which your transformation is or is not possible. Choosing those people deliberately, with the transformation in mind rather than with comfort and familiarity as the primary criteria, is one of the highest leverage things a person can do in the service of the transformation they say they want. You change what you consume. Not only in the dietary sense, though that matters too, but in the informational and cultural sense. What you read, what you watch, what you listen to, what occupies the background of your attention during the hours when you are not actively focused on anything. The mind is continuously being shaped by what passes through it, not in a simple input-output way, but in the more subtle way of the environment that normalizes certain ways of thinking and certain ways of seeing and certain beliefs about what is possible and what is required. A person who consumes, in their discretionary attention, primarily content that is designed to be comfortable and entertaining and that requires nothing from them is not maintaining a neutral internal environment. They are actively cultivating an internal environment that is oriented toward reception and consumption rather than generation and transformation. The person who uses the same hours to read the minds of people who have done the thing they are trying to do, to expose themselves to the thinking and the standards and the creative and intellectual challenges of the level they are trying to reach, is cultivating a different internal environment, one that is continuously recalibrating what is normal, what is expected, what is possible, and what the person sitting in the middle of it is capable of. You change your relationship with failure, which is perhaps the most critical single transformation in the entire process and the one that most people have most thoroughly avoided thinking about clearly. The avoidance of failure, not just the experience of it, but the possibility of it, the risk of it, the vulnerability of attempting something where failure is a genuine option, is the single most consistent behavior of people who do not transform. It presents itself in 100 different forms. The project that is perpetually being refined rather than released. The business that remains in the planning stage because the planning stage is safe in a way the execution stage is not. The relationship that is not pursued because the possibility of rejection is more immediately threatening than the absence of connection. The career change that is researched exhaustively but never initiated because research maintains optionality in a way that action eliminates. The conversation that is rehearsed but never had because the rehearsal can be controlled and the conversation cannot. All of these behaviors are rational from the perspective of a system designed to avoid threat. All of them are catastrophic from the perspective of a person trying to build a life that is genuinely theirs, because failure is not the opposite of transformation. Failure is the mechanism of transformation in the specific sense that the information available in genuine failure, in the experience of attempting something real and having it not work, is the most reliable and most irreplaceable source of the self-knowledge that transformation requires. Goleman's research on resilience, on what distinguishes people who recover from failure and use it productively from people who are stopped by it and defined by it, identified several factors that are not about the failure itself, but about the relationship with failure that the person brings to it. The person who has been allowed to fail and recover in smaller ways throughout their development, whose early failures were not catastrophized by the people around them and were not experienced as devastating verdicts on their fundamental worth, carries into adult life a nervous system that has evidence of its own resilience. It has experienced failure and survival. It knows at a level below explicit thought that failure is survivable. This makes the risk of failure significantly less threatening and therefore significantly less likely to produce the avoidance behaviors that prevent the attempts that would produce either success or the information that comes from genuinely trying. The person who has been protected from failure or who has experienced failure in conditions that were catastrophic and unrecovered from carries a different nervous system, one that has no evidence of its own resilience, that interprets the risk of failure as genuinely threatening to survival, and that produces correspondingly powerful avoidance behaviors that look, from the outside, like lack of ambition or lack of effort, but that are actually the entirely rational behavior of a system that has not yet been shown that the thing it is protecting against is survivable. This matters enormously for how the transformation is forced, because it means that forcing the transformation is not simply a matter of acting despite fear. It is a matter of generating, through deliberate action in the presence of fear, the specific experiences that will teach your nervous system what it has not yet been taught. That the fear is survivable. That the failure is survivable. That the version of you that exists on the other side of the difficult experience is not diminished but expanded, and that the expansion is worth the fear it cost. Every time you force yourself through a genuine difficulty and survive it, you are not simply completing a task. You are training your nervous system with data that it will use to calibrate every subsequent risk assessment. You are building, through the accumulation of survived difficulties, the specific kind of confidence that cannot be acquired any other way, not through affirmation, not through the support of other people, not through the intellectual understanding of why you should be more courageous, but only through the direct, embodied, nervous system level experience of having been afraid and acted anyway and found yourself still standing on the other side. The fourth transformation that must be forced, and that no one else can force for you, is the transformation in what you demand of yourself. Not in the harsh, self-punishing sense of relentless standards that produce anxiety rather than excellence, but in the genuine sense of the bar you set for what is acceptable from yourself as a minimum, the floor below which you will not allow yourself to fall without consequence, the standards you hold yourself to not because someone else is watching but because you have decided that the person you are becoming requires them. Most people's internal standards are negotiable in ways they would be embarrassed to articulate. They are negotiable in response to how tired they are, how discouraged they feel, how long the transformation is taking, how much the people around them seem to be getting away with lower standards. The internal standard drops when external conditions are difficult, which is precisely when the internal standard most needs to hold, because the external conditions are difficult for everyone, and what distinguishes the person who transforms from the person who doesn't is frequently not the difficulty of their circumstances but the integrity of their internal standards in the face of those circumstances. Goleman wrote about what he called the internal compass. The internalized set of values and standards that guides behavior in the absence of external enforcement, that produces the behavior the person most wants to produce not because of external reward or punishment, but because the behavior is aligned with who the person has decided to be. The development of this internal compass is not automatic. It is not simply a matter of having the right values intellectually, of being able to articulate what you believe and what you stand for. It is the translation of those intellectual commitments into behavioral commitments that hold under pressure, that remain operative when the pressure to compromise them is highest, when the external environment is actively rewarding the compromise, when the people around you are making the compromise and finding it entirely comfortable and wondering why you are not doing the same. The person with a genuine internal compass does not require the external environment to be arranged correctly in order to behave correctly. They carry the arrangement with them. They apply it consistently not because the consistency is being observed and rewarded, but because the inconsistency, the gap between what they say they stand for and what they do in the moments when standing for it costs something, is something they find genuinely intolerable at a level below performance and below the management of how they appear. The intolerance of that gap is the internal compass. And it is both the most powerful driver of transformation and the one that has to be most deliberately cultivated, because the external environment is not organized to cultivate it. The external environment, in most of its forms, is organized around the normalization of the gap, around the implicit message that what you do when no one is watching is a private matter, and what you say you stand for is a public one, and that the relationship between them is flexible and negotiable and primarily determined by what you can get away with. The person who decides to force their transformation is the person who decides that the gap is not acceptable. Not as a performance of integrity for an audience, not as a story they are telling about who they are, but as a genuine lived, daily refusal to allow the distance between the person they are trying to become and the person they are actually being in this specific moment to be rationalized as acceptable given the circumstances. That refusal, sustained over time and through difficulty and in the face of every argument, the comfort-seeking self can generate for why this particular moment is an exception and the standard can be temporarily lowered, is the engine of transformation, not the dramatic decision, not the breakthrough moment, not the right mentor, or the perfect book, or the ideal circumstances, the daily, unglamorous, frequently lonely refusal to accept the gap between what you are capable of and what you are currently doing as a permanent feature of your life rather than a temporary condition that the transformation is in the process of closing. The fifth transformation, and the one that most directly addresses the loneliness of this process, is the transformation in how you relate to the fact that no one else can do this for you. Because that fact, the fact that is the title of this entire piece, is one that most people intellectually accept and emotionally resist for years, sometimes for the entirety of their adult lives. The intellectual acceptance is easy. Of course no one else can transform me. Of course the responsibility is ultimately mine. Of course I cannot wait for external conditions to change before the internal transformation begins. Everyone knows this. The emotional resistance to it is something entirely different and considerably more consequential, because the emotional resistance is not to the idea, but to the felt experience of it. The specific loneliness of sitting with the full weight of your own responsibility for your own life without the comfort of being able to locate the cause of the gap somewhere other than in yourself. The comfort of blame, even when the blame is partially accurate, is the comfort of a distributed responsibility. If part of what is wrong is their fault or circumstances' fault or the system's fault, then part of the transformation is also their job or circumstances' job or the system's job. The removal of that comfort, the genuine felt acceptance of full responsibility for the gap and for its closing, is one of the most demanding emotional experiences the transformation requires. And it is one that most people encounter and retreat from, returning to some version of the distributed responsibility model because the alternative is simply too exposed, too lonely, too without the buffer of someone else to hold partially accountable. Goleman understood that genuine emotional maturity, the full development of emotional intelligence in its most demanding forms, requires exactly this acceptance. Not as a denial of the ways that circumstances and other people genuinely shape a person's life and options. Those influences are real and should not be dismissed. But as the recognition that however real those influences are, the response to them is yours. The choices made in the presence of difficult circumstances are yours. The decision about what those circumstances mean and what they require is yours. The work of transformation, in whatever circumstances it has to be done, belongs to you and to no one else. Not because the world is fair, or because you are entirely the author of your own situation, but because the only person who can inhabit your life is you. The only person who can feel what it actually feels like to be you, navigating the specific challenges of your specific existence, and decide that it is not enough, and move in the direction of something better. That person is you. There is no substitute for that person. There is no proxy. There is no authority who can grant the transformation or withhold it. No relationship that can complete it. No external achievement that can produce it. There is only the decision, made again and again in the specific texture of your actual life, to close the gap by whatever means are available, starting from wherever you actually are, regardless of whether the starting point is the one you would have chosen. The moment that decision becomes real, not the moment you say it, but the moment you actually mean it and act from it, is the moment the transformation begins. Not the moment it completes. The completion is long, non-linear, frequently discouraging, and never fully finished. But the beginning is available in any moment, in this moment, in the specific circumstances of the life you are currently living, with the history you actually have and the resources that are actually available and the fears that are actually present. The transformation does not begin when the circumstances are better. It does not begin when you are less afraid. It does not begin when the right support is in place or the right opportunity has arrived or the right version of yourself is ready. It begins when you force it to begin. When you decide, in the absence of all external permission and all ideal conditions and all guarantee of success, that the gap between the life you are living and the life you are capable of living is no longer something you are willing to tolerate as a permanent arrangement. When you stop waiting for someone to do it for you, stop waiting for the world to arrange itself in your favor, stop waiting for the fear to resolve before you act, and begin, imperfectly, uncomfortably, without a complete plan or a guaranteed outcome, or the full support of everyone around you, the only work that was ever going to matter. The work of becoming, through your own deliberate and sustained and often forced effort, the person your life has been waiting for you to be. No one is coming. That is the difficult truth and the liberating one. No one is coming because no one can come. Because the transformation is yours in the most fundamental sense. It is made of your choices, your attention, your willingness, your decision about what your life is for and what you are willing to pay to make it that. The day you stop waiting for the rescue and start doing the forcing is the day the trajectory of your life changes. Not the day the results appear. Not the day the fear disappears. Not the day it becomes easy. The day you stop waiting. That day is not determined by any external event. It is determined entirely by you. And it can be today.